Thank you. Yeah. So sorry about those technical issues. Yeah, I'm also, I guess I wanted to mention, sorry if I missed some of your presentations. I haven't been, my health hasn't been the best lately. Um, okay, so let me just try and get to the point of what I want to talk about. Right. So there's this thesis in metaphysics called Humean supervenience. And broadly speaking, it's just the thesis that the truths about worlds like ours supervene on the distribution uh, of fundamental properties to points in spacetime. It was a thesis put forward by David Lewis. Tentatively, a thesis put forward tentatively, and the model for the thesis is supposed to be something like classical physics, Newtonian mechanics. And over the years, there have been a number of objections put forward against Humean supervenience. And I guess part of the interest that I have here is just I don't know that I believe in Humean supervenience, but I think that it's an interesting thesis because it connects two interesting threads, I guess you could say. One thread from methodology. So for example, one of the motivations Lewis had for putting forward the view of Humean supervenience was just his desire to take the scientific image and reconcile it with the manifest image. So we have in our world we have stuff like minds, we have stuff like currencies and societies, and we have all sorts of entities and properties, and we want to see how they can fit with the sort of sparse picture that is given by some of the models we have in physics. And that was part of the motivation for the view. And then obviously there's the metaphysical question of whether our world really is like Humean supervenience describes, or something a little bit like that. Maybe it's not exactly like that. We know for a fact, for example, that so one of the claims of Humean supervenience, for example, is that this distribution, this set of truths that supervenes on the fundamental distribution of properties to points is going to depend on just the distribution in local regions. So we know for a fact, because of Bell's theorem, that every quantum mechanics is a non-local theory. So in that respect, Humean supervenience must straightforwardly be revised. But there are some other issues there that you might think whether they might retain some plausibility, right? So, for example, let me give you this very quick example of why it's like an interesting metaphysical methodological thesis to think about. So, for example, if some of you have played video games, then, for example, if you have played Super Mario Bros. Or at some point, you might think, for example, of how the different, the distribution of the properties in Mario worlds, world 1, world 1, 2, world 1, 3. And you will notice that, the properties that Mario has and the properties of those worlds just depends on the distribution of what are the colors and the density and the order relations between the pixels on the screen. That suffices to describe everything about those worlds. So I guess for at least some people, and I count myself as one of those people, that sort of picture of how the world might be carries a lot of intuitiveness. So it's I guess it's easy for people like me to think about relations of metaphysical dependence being something like this. And then what I mean that it might be possible to respond to those objections against Humean supervenience in a way that retains the spirit of the view. Part of what I mean by the spirit of the view is just this idea, this picture of the Super Mario World universe, where the properties of those worlds just supervenes on the distribution of the fundamental properties in which is color and order and so on to the pixels. Is something like that salvageable? So that's sort of the question here. I mean, I guess I'll try to say something a little bit more about methodology with regards to this, because I think like there are some interesting things there to mention in regards to stuff like primitive ontology and something like that. But okay, so what are the two fundamental objections that I want to consider, and to what specific part of human supervenience are they connected? So there are many assumptions in human supervenience, but one of the, there are three main assumptions. One is the assumption that truth supervenes on being. So if there's a fact or something is true, then that truth is going to depend on something existing somewhere. There's going to be some ontological fact that grounds the truth of claims about the world. So that's one of the claims. Another one of the claims is the anti-Haxaitis claim. So the anti-Haxaitis claim is just the idea that if you give a description, just a pure qualitative description of what's going on at a Humean world, then that fixes all the facts about that world. So there are no facts about specific individuals. That's the second claim. And then the third claim that goes together with human supervenience is the spatiotemporal claim. So in the original formulation of Lewis, the spatiotemporal claim is just a claim that the fundamental relations between material points or material objects are just the spatiotemporal relations. And then what I want to say is that two of the most popular objections against human supervenience are really objections that go against the spatiotemporal thesis. So one of the objections, as I mentioned, as a sort of preliminary, is the objection from quantum entanglement. And so the idea here will be that we know that for some quantum systems, the quantum state of those systems is not going to supervene just on the distribution of properties to individual systems, but sometimes it will depend on more global properties of those systems. So that's the objection from quantum entanglement. For example, Motley devotes some of his discussion of human supervenience in the Metaphysics within Physics to try to undermine the view, basically going with this objection. And then the other objection is an objection that Haslanger put forward against the view, which is that even if you remain just at the classical level of the Newtonian inspired view, or spatiotemporal inspired view, even at that level, human supervenience is false, because facts about the persistence conditions of material objects do not supervene on the distribution of fundamental properties to points. So, for example, there are these two popular views in persistence. Well, there are three popular views, but the two mainstream ones, perdurantism and exdurantism. So perdurantism is just the view that material objects persist by having temporal parts at different times. And endurantism is the view that material objects persist by being wholly present at different times. I mean, there are more sophisticated formulations of those views, but for the sake of time, I will just, for the moment, I will just stick to those. So there's nothing, according to Haslanger, in human supervenience, which lets us, decide between whether objects perdure or endure. Now, I mean, let me just flag immediately that some people here might be skeptical that that's actually like a substantive discussion. I'm not going to engage with that for the sake of, just given time constraints. But so basically the idea here is that there are two horns, right? So either the world is going to be in some way quantum mechanical, which seems very plausible, or it's going to retain space-time structure at the fundamental level, which even some authors today still suggest, right? For example, Wallace and Timpson, people like that. So those two look like plausible alternatives. And then it seems like both objections, the objection from entanglement and the objection from persistence, both of those undermine the tenability of human supervenience in those two cases. So and then part of what I'm saying in the paper, that the draft that I have, that the stuff that I've been thinking about, is that there are two ways for the philosopher defending Humean supervenience to try to respond to these objections, which are in a sense incompatible. So on the one hand, then there's the move of weakening the space-time assumption. So for example, instead of saying something like the fundamental relation, the fundamental relations between material objects are spatial-temporal relations, say something like the fundamental relations between material objects are natural external relations. You know, where an external relation is just a relation that supervenes on you know, the relata together with the methodological fusion of the relata. So that's what I'm understanding by external relation. So that's that, and I'm going to develop the argument for that in a second. But that will be one of the moves to weaken the space-time assumption. And then the other possible move is to strengthen the space-time assumption and say something like, well, you know, not only are the spatial-temporal relations the fundamental relations, but there's really no reason to suppose that we have a duality of material objects and space-time regions. We should just think on the classical picture. We should just think of the ontology of the material world as consisting of space-time regions. So some sort of version of supersubstantialism. And then my claim is the following. My claim is that if you consider certain methodological assumptions that come from metaphysics, which I will mention in a second, it's possible in each of those cases to defend the weak space-time assumption and the strong space-time assumption, and in that respect to respond to the objections. Now, some of you might be wondering, this seems, I mean, if both of those assumptions are incompatible, then what's the point, in a sense? Like, what's the point of saying that you can respond to one or the other by, you know, doing these philosophical moves if you can reconcile them? And then I guess part of my response here might not make everyone happy, but I mean, that's the nature of the thing. But you know, metaphysics partly is hostage to scientific progress, and you know, the current scientific worldview. And you know, our best theories in science, you know, theories like quantum mechanics, even quantum field theory, cannot be altogether reconciled with general relativity. So I mean, there are many ways, I guess, of framing that problem, but since we have an incomplete, I guess if you grant that sort of gives us an incomplete picture in terms of, you know, scientific models or scientific approaches to the world, then it makes sense to try to make some sort of, you know, tentative metaphysics of at the level we are at. So the incompatibility of those two, you know, weakening and strengthening the space-time assumption, that incompatibility doesn't necessarily undermine the whole project, but results as you know, as the nature of the state of the art right now in the scientific discussion. So I don't have, I guess, that much time to go into the deep details, but so I guess let me just talk to you a little bit about how the argument for the weak space-time assumption and the strong space-time assumption go. So the argument for the weak space-time assumption is just remember that the sort of picture that we are trying to preserve, right? So the sort of like Mario Bros. Inspired picture, where you have, you know, you have some sort of points, a collection of points with some, you know, mathematical structures over them, you know, like ordered, maybe some topology, something like that. Then we assign some fundamental properties to that structure, and then from that we get all the facts. So that's like, you know, sort of the picture that we're trying to recover, right? So what are the good, and obviously, you know, if you in quantum mechanics, we have stuff like the measurement problem. We have you know, the algorithm for quantum mechanics, and we need to. I mean, there are some philosophers who reject the measurement problem approach, you know, Bob and Pitowski, etc. But suppose you stay with the mainstream for a second, and you think that the measurement problem is, you know, like a serious problem that needs to be addressed, you know, by putting forward some sort of metaphysical theory of what quantum mechanics says there is. So we know that we have three mainstream approaches to a standard quantum mechanics to explain how, how to reconcile the different dynamics of the measurement problem, a Schrodinger evolution and, the Born rule. Which are those three approaches? GRW, many worlds, and Bohmian mechanics, right? So, and we know that all of those three approaches posit at the fundamental level the wave function, and the relevant structures to understand the wave function. So a wave function, we can understand a wave function mathematically as just a function that goes from configuration space, which is the set of all copies of the set of all copies of R3 to the complex numbers. So it's basically just this function, and we know that, for example, if we think a little bit about how fields are thought of in classical physics, for example, the electromagnetic field, we have this very intuitive picture of the electromagnetic field as just this function that goes from the classical 4D spacetime to R4, the set of real numbers that make up that spacetime. And usually when we think about fields in the classical picture, we tend to reify them. We tend to think of these of fields as real things that actually exist there materially. And many people are obviously, for good reasons, methodological reasons, I think, reluctant to think of the configuration space of quantum mechanics as a real physical space. Just as, for example, people are very reluctant to think of the phase space in classical mechanics as a real fundamental space. They think that configuration space and the wave function in quantum mechanics are just abstract representations. They are not physical things. But lately some philosophers have been defending views that which belong to a family of views called wave function realism. And among those views, there are at least some which are pretty radical. For example, Jill North has defended some of these views that configuration space should be thought of as a fundamental physical space. And what's the argument for that claim? That's Jill North's argument, right? But I think that it has some, I guess, at least methodological, historical plausibility if you connect it to the history of metaphysics. So, as many of you may know, in the history of metaphysics, we had this argument for mathematical objects, the indispensability argument. Quine Putnam, basically the idea is if you need whatever mathematical objects you need to do physics are indispensable, whatever that are indispensable to physics, you should think of them as real. And then Jill North has a sort of version of that argument that she applies to configuration space. And then part of the idea is, look at the fundamental laws of your best theory in physics. What structures are required for those laws to work? And then think of those structures as real structures, right? So that's sort of the argument for the physical reality of configuration space. And then you can think of configuration space in if you buy all that, which, it's a lot to buy, but if you buy all that, then you can understand the metaphor of thinking of configuration space and the wave function as analogous to classical fields in, classical physics as the electromagnetic field. You just have a mapping of fundamental properties, whatever properties going to quantum mechanics to every point in configuration space. And then obviously you're going to have very different ways of accounting for dynamics and probability depending on whether you are discussing Bohmian mechanics, in which case you might need like an extra guidance equation, or if you're doing GRW, in which case you need to, fix for collapses and stuff like that. So you need to add some stuff apart from that, right? But at least you have this picture of, the structure with the fundamental physical assignment to points. And if you add a little bit more, then you can get something like Humean supervenience on this view. And then I guess, there are 2 points here to mention, which are very important. Obviously there's a lot more to say, but again, time constraints. So one of the points that is important to mention is it's not clear how the 3D world can even be recovered from something like that, from a sparse view like that. There's some speculation. I'm no physicist, of course. People like Albert think that, for example, the Hamiltonian that is associated with interactions, physical interactions, tends to select certain triples in configuration space, which sort of will give us like the formal, sort of select something like the formal structure that you need for 3D spaces. So maybe it emerges from something like that. Maybe the physical world we interact with on a daily basis emerges from something like that. That's just pure speculation, but at least there's some proposal there, right, of how it will happen. And then the other point, which is important to mention, is obviously configuration space is not any sort of it's very different from space-time. Its structure is widely different from space-time. It's still a vector space, but it doesn't have any of the properties that we think of space-time as having. But you could still plausibly say that if those are the fundamental, if that's actually like an actual physical space, and those are the fundamental relations between material points, then you could treat them as natural external relations. So they are not going to be spatiotemporal relations, but they might, for all that, still be natural spatiotemporal relations. Where by natural, I just mean this idea that this sort of idea of something that goes together with the fundamental, informally speaking. So that's a sort of way in which you could respond to the objection from entanglement, because you're taking some distance from the typical 3D space and going to a different space where you can still maintain some of the spirit of the view. There are some other views called wavefunction realism, which are less radical than this, but I think those views do not manage to save the claim that all you need is a fundamental space and distribution of fundamental properties to points. So, for example, the Wallace and Timpson approach, which takes physical spacetime as fundamental, and it takes the wave function as a sort of property of spacetime. It has to take the whole wave function, so it doesn't really salvage that part of the thesis. So moving on from that to the spacetime case, I don't know how much time I have. Maybe
I think you have like I don't know, like 10-15 minutes, Ronnie. I don't know. You're muted. We cannot hear you.
Sorry, you have 13 minutes.
Okay, great. So right, so for the I mean, that was a bit too quick, but again, as I mentioned, it's part of the idea is to explore these two objections connected to the space-time thesis. And then the other objection, again, is inspired on the other horn. What happens if we keep space-time at the fundamental level? Does that fix, do all the fundamental truths about space-time fix all the truths about those worlds? And then, as I mentioned, Haslanger had this argument that, if you have all the truths about fundamental, the fundamental distribution of properties to space-time points in classical space-time, let's just talk even general relativity, for example, that fails to fix the conditions of persistence for material objects. There's nothing there that says anything about whether we should think of objects as enduring or perduring. But I think that we should be methodologically inclined, and maybe the methodology here is a guide to metaphysics. We should be methodologically inclined to reject endurantism, I think. And the reason for that is if we think, so for example, if we think of space-time structure, we know, for example, that space-time, classical space-time theories, for example, Newtonian mechanics, Galilean space-time, Minkowski space-time, have certain specific structures, right? They have topological structures, they have metric, for continuity, they have metrical structures for distance relations, or in Minkowski spacetime, we have the interval, which satisfies many of the properties of the metric, though not all. And we have, a fine structure, which lets us distinguish between trajectories which have some curvature and those which do not. And all of those allow us to, ground the fundamental dynamical laws of those classical spacetimes. Because, obviously one of the things that we want to account for when we're thinking about fundamental spacetimes is motion. Both linear acceleration and rotation. And one way of doing that is obviously by having at the fundamental level this distinction between trajectories, material trajectories which are linear and which are curved, and those which aren't, those which are straight and those which are curved. And that will allow us to for example, talk about stuff like velocities and distinguish them from accelerations, etc., right? And because of the smoothness properties of the time-like trajectories of those objects, we should be able to use calculus to, and obviously at a higher level, the Hamiltonian mechanics to give us sort of, the dynamics of the world that helps us save the dynamical phenomena, the dynamical laws. But again, I mean, we can just by employing the methodology that I was discussing earlier, which is take the fundamental structures required to for your fundamental dynamical laws to run in those structures to be basic, right? And then we know that the fundamental dynamical laws, Newton's laws, we can ground them with these space-time that have all of these structures. I mean, obviously, for example, the move from Newtonian space-time to Minkowski space-time and so on, that move was motivated by the fact that we needed to ground other separate different physical laws. For example, the electromagnetic properties, the Maxwell equations. We needed to make them consistent with those space-time structures. So so it seems like we can ground all of those structures, all of those laws in that fundamental space-time structure. So, and we don't really need to have this duality of material objects and space-time on these views. We could just take fields and think of material objects as certain assignments of fields to space-time regions. That's basically all we need to at least, I mean, at the level of physics. Obviously, I'm not telling a story about higher level phenomena, but at the level of physics, this is what we need. And if we do that at the level of physics, in order to in order to account for all facts about classical space-time world, we are just going to only if all we need is a space-time structure plus fields, and we don't need material objects, then according to some of these metaphysical principles or methodological principles, we should dispense with them. But then, if that's the case, notice that all we have left is space-time regions with fields instantiated at them. And then here are two possibilities, right? I mean, one of them I really won't discuss it much because I don't think that this is not a metaphysics, an a priori metaphysics conference. So maybe there might not be so much interest in that, but if anyone is interested in that, you can let me know. But so here are two possibilities, right? Either the material object is identical to the space-time region, with the field instantiated over the region, in which case you automatically get perdurantism because space-time regions decompose in the way in which perdurant, four-dimensional objects decompose. That's one possibility, and another possibility is that there are people like Cody Gilmore who have said that if you have two different sort of fundamental relations at the space-time level, so for example, if you have topological relations on the one hand, the ones that hold between space-time regions, like the subregion relation, and on the other hand, you have mereological relations between that also hold between those space-time regions. Then it might be the case that a material object and a space-time region coincide mereologically without being identical. So in Gilmore's case, he's thinking of a sort of mereology where you give up something which is called the strong extensionality axiom. But again, that's just like that's like a sort of very a priori metaphysics claim. But then the argument that I have against, so for example, if you take the view that spacetime that material objects are identical to spacetime regions, given that you don't need nothing but regions and fields on this account, then you don't need to say anything else. That should give you perdurantism. But if you think that there are these two different sets of relations, that might cause a problem. So my argument against that is simply that, for example, the most fundamental relation that we use to think about parthood and material objects is just a subregion relation. I mean, we talk about parthood in ordinary discourse. In typical, in typical daily life, we talk about both parts and subregions. But at the geometrical level, it's really just a subregion relation that we're thinking about. And we know, as a result of model theory, we know that if you have a theory that satisfies the axioms of classical mereology, then a spacetime with the subregion relation should also, because those two relations have similar formal behavior, that should also satisfy those axioms. So, and because the geometrical theory is a more fundamental theory, and it remains so. I mean, that remains so for both the Newtonian case, the Galilean case, the Minkowski case, the general relativistic case, where we have Cauchy surfaces. These are geometrical objects. So because the geometry is more fundamental, then there we should just dispense at the fundamental level with the mereological relations. We shouldn't think of them as basic, and just take the space-time relations as basic. So either way, so in either case, given all of those assumptions, you should think of the material objects, as the material objects as persisting through time in the four-dimensional way. And that will be the way of defending the strong space-time assumption. So, and that's basically sort of like the two ways I'm considering of responding to those objections. And again, you might wonder, well, how did this come together at the end? And just like I mentioned before, physics right now is in a sort of it's at a point where we have many different sorts of approaches. For example, for grounding quantum gravity, and some of them get rid of a space-time, make it emergent, but some of them don't. Some of them even consider other types of relations, for example, causal set theory. So I think that it's okay to do some metaphysics, which is, tentative, and it's at the stage in which the science is right now. And yeah, that's it, basically.
Thank you, Moisés. So we have plenty of time for questions and Q&A. Did you raise your hand? Oh, Otávio.
No, I didn't. But I like very much, Moisés, your explanation. There are lots of things, but so many things. Of course, what do you expectative about quantum gravity? What do you think about? Is there some more interesting approach than others, or you think they are equivalent, or something like that? Look at quantum gravity, string theories, and so on. What do you think about?
I mean, I cannot talk about those things with any sort of expertise, but my proclivities, I guess, for those things is, I mean, I have serious doubts that we can use pragmatic criteria to decide what is the fundamental nature of the world. But I guess, I mean, that's sort of what we have left. And I think that, I mean, we shouldn't rule out a priori that certain approaches would take something like, some sort of space-time theory, which keeps some sort of space-time theory as fundamental. We shouldn't rule out any of those approaches, because we also know, for example, for reasons of mathematical logic and model theory, that if we have, domains which are very large, we can build whatever structure we want from those types of domains, for the purposes at hand. So, I mean, I think that all of those are in play, but I guess some of them will fit some. I mean, this is something that people do have, right? Like we have certain antecedent metaphysical beliefs about how the world is, which we, for some reason, some of us which take metaphysics more seriously, we really cannot quit those beliefs. Like even if other people are very skeptical, like some of us are just like doomed to live with them. So people who have those types of beliefs can use those together with, the abundant mathematical structures we have to see where we can find solutions, bridges, connections, the sort of stuff that you should expect from a more fundamental theory to give you at some point.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now, Otávio, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this, Moisés. I want to press you on the use of the indispensability argument in support of a configuration space realism. I know you had all kind of, look, we need to accept all kinds of things and so on, kind of qualms here. But for the life of me, I honestly cannot see, right, how from the fact that certain theoretical construct is needed, and I'm willing even to grant that it's indispensable for the formulation of some theories. Why should we take a realist reading out of that? Right? This is part of a framework. Right? It's part. Think about in analogy with mathematics. Right? We use mathematics indispensably to formulate quantum mechanics, but it would be very odd to say, well, we have to believe that there are vectors in Hilbert spaces because that's required for the formulation of quantum mechanics, right? And in fact, you run that by a physicist, and the response would be, look, this is just the mathematics, right? I'm interested in what's beyond that, what under a certain interpretation those things would stand for. And the indispensability argument is just irrelevant for that, right? So, I'm a little skeptical of that kind of way of ontologizing our work.
Right. No, I mean, I think that that's a very important criticism that you're making. I think that you're right that it's not clear why we should buy the indispensability arguments in general. But I mean, I guess I do have some sympathy for indispensability arguments. Not necessarily perhaps in the way that Putnam and Quine were intending them, for example, in the case of, set theory for mathematics. But I guess I have, I was mentioning before when I was talking about with Desi about, what I thought in general about methodology for approaches in scientific theories. And I guess one of the things that as someone who does metaphysics, I think that it's plausible to think something like the principle that truth supervenes on being. So I do have these sorts of views, which I know because I know I've seen you discuss some of these issues that you don't buy, but some of these claims. So I find those sorts of metaphysical claims plausible, right? And then I guess what I'm thinking is that you need some sort of account that lets you connect the mathematics with, the physical world in some way in which you can explain according to some of the constraints that some metaphysicians like me believe why are they so successful in doing that, right? And then my claim is not that you can get something like Platonism from that immediately, or for example in the relevant case here something like configuration space immediately, but you might need to get some sort of structure there. So for example, there might be people who, for example, Phil Bricker, who's my professor at UMass, he's not he believes in in the plurality of worlds. He's still a model realist, so he's going to end up grounding the mathematical structures in actual physical things. I don't know that that's exactly the way I will go, but I guess I'm sympathetic to something like I guess anti-REM structuralism or something like that, given these other principles. So and so that's on the point of the indispensability arguments, right? And then again, that's not going to convince an anti-realist, but for people who already accept some metaphysical claims, that's a reason for them to maybe think about those arguments in that respect. So that's the first claim. The second claim about whether we don't know for a fact that we need configuration space. Yeah, I mean, for sure we know. For example, I'm not even talking about quantum field theory, right? So I don't. I'm just talking about standard quantum mechanics. We know that the typical models do use configuration space. So it's just a claim about what is like a necessary condition for the typical approaches to work. But yeah, and in a sense, I mean, it's a very. I'm agnostic about whether whether we should think of configuration space as fundamental, but I think that there's just like a general methodological interest in these questions, independently of whether you accept that or not.
Thanks a lot, Moisés.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for more questions if you.
So let me just make one comment then, Moisés. Since you're thinking about whether to follow Philip Breaker on the particular issue of grounding mathematical structures in the worlds, I think even if there are enough worlds, it's not clear that you will have enough of them to ground, say, the inaccessibly many things that will be required given, say, our current understanding of set theory, right? So, and also, even if there were such things, which is hard to even to imagine, the idea of inaccessibly many is such an ingrained set theoretic notion that we end up in a circle, right? Because to make sense of that, what is that we are grounding the objects in, we need to invoke exactly the kind of mathematics they're supposed to be grounded. And that seems to me kind of worrisome, let's put it that way. And so...
Right. I mean, no, I think that this is. I always think that these are, these types of objections are very pertinent. I mean, obviously, I do not want to take like a really large detour on philosophy of mathematics and metaphysics of mathematics right now to discuss, how many words there are and principles of inaccessibility. So I will just say like a couple of things really, really quickly. So one thing, obviously, I mean, I think perhaps you might be alluding to problems with, something like the diverse Miller objections about how many words can we recover from, even in model realism, like can we match, all the intuitions we have about modality from that sort of basis. And I think that, I mean, those are legitimate worries, but there are like research programs, some by Breaker, some by Daniel Nolan, some by Hawthorne and Jeff Russell, that explore those types of, like, what sort of principles of plenitude you might need to recover something like that. So that's, I guess, one thing. And the other thing is that, I mean, I agree that mathematical intuitions seem pretty ingrained. But for example, linguistic intuitions do seem very ingrained with us, right? Again, like, like something like, for example, the poverty of stimulus argument, like Chomsky's, we have like these abilities to structure grammatical sentences. But for all that, we might think that that doesn't mean, for example, that there are like that we can use language to capture like a number of facts about the world, just because we have maybe some cognitive structures that presuppose to think about the world in some way. So I guess that I think that it's still consistent with the methodological approaches in foundations of mathematics to think in this manner. But again, I think that I don't want to weaken the problems here. Just
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead. That's you. No? Okay. So we still have 5 more minutes. If anyone should want to make a quick remark. So if there is no further comments, Moisés, would you like to add something else to wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing I will say is that again, this is mostly a talk on metaphysics, and I guess part of you know, in connection to for example some of the discussions on primitive ontology that were going on, right? So for example, one worry which might arise from thinking of configuration space as fundamental is that you might lose some of the symmetries of your typical physical theories. So that's like a further methodological worry that you might hear. So for example, that's like an opposition. That will be a sort of like tension between views on primitive ontology and views on and Humean supervenience taking configuration space as fundamental. But there are also like there are also stuff in which they are similar. So for example, just as primitive ontology aims at giving an account of, you know, the physical world in terms of, for example, structures that we're more familiar with and that we have a better grasp of, such as three-dimensional spaces and, you know, an ontology of material stuff with locations in those spaces. The Humean is also trying to recover this idea, like a sort of method of an idea or an intuitive idea about what worlds could be. That's sort of grounded in our some of the typical ways in which we think about, you know, objects. So you know, like just geometrical or structured, you know, objects having some properties here and there, stuff like that. Like these are some very intuitive models or representations that we make metaphysically that sometimes inform the physics that we're making. And I'm thinking that one of the things that these two sorts of programs have in common is that they oppose, for example, views such as Motley's. So, for example, Motley believes that the quantum state is its own thing. Like we shouldn't think of the wave function or the state vector as something reducible to any of the old categories. We should think of it as a sort of new category. And then I guess I find that interesting. I find it interesting that you know these two approaches, which are very different. One is in philosophy of science, one is in metaphysics. They are aiming at trying to classify the world and structure the world according to certain modes of representation that we have more familiarity with, including quantum mechanics, as opposed to something like Motley's approach.